Again, thank you all for coming tonight. I'd like to introduce our speaker for the evening, Dr. Jerome Huyler. Right? Dr. Huyler is a PhD in political science and assistant professor at Seton Hall University. And I went to St. Peter's College, so we were big basketball rivals for a period of time. I want you to know that. He is the author of Locke in America, The Moral Philosophy of the Founding Era, and his latest, Everything You Have, The Case Against Welfare, is sure to provoke and provide and enrich the debate about what's happening today. Dr. Huyler presents the case for making the government a protector that could help people. These are my own words, by the way. You didn't actually say this. But that could help people to thrive, not a provider that helps people merely to survive. He submits that many of the current proposals to save the U.S. from a too big and too intrusive government, such as term limits, balanced budget amendment, flat tax, etc., are too little and too late. His solution of cut and close will enrich debate about what can be done. His latest book is available back there. It's back there at a discount. I know some people already bought some, but you'll want to take a look at this. Please give Dr. Huyler a round of applause for coming.
Let me see, I'll speak without a microphone, but if there's any difficulty hearing me, I'll grab the microphone right away. I should grab the microphone right away, I'm told by our cameraman. Okay, here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to hear a perspective, a plan, a proposal to rescue the country, unlike anyone else is talking about. I'm going to explain the reason for it, and as Al mentioned, my theme, the theme of the book is the case against welfare. I'm going to explain what I mean by welfare in careful detail as we proceed. It is not what is commonly thought of as welfare. It's that and so much more. Okay, I once read someplace that a good speaker knows who he's speaking to before he starts speaking. That always made a lot of sense to me. So, let me see if I can find a common denominator. Regardless of all the differences that exist in the room, backgrounds, religious denominations, interests, occupations, I think what brings you and me together is the idea that this country is headed in the wrong direction. It has somehow gone horribly off course. I agree with that myself. And you understand that this is not small potatoes, that everything is at stake with this wrong turn the country took and the direction it is now headed. And if it isn't impacting any of us, it will have an enormous impact, and a dastardly one, on our children, our grandchildren. This is no longer the nation it was, and things will get much harder. Hardship will spread, opportunity will be diminished. Well, if that's the case, then we're all here trying to figure out what the solution is. How do we reverse course? If you accept my premise, as I explained it this evening, you will come to see the very moment the country first lost its way, the precise moment this country first derailed. And you're going to be surprised when that moment was. You'll also get a sense of how we got from that early day to this. I think I can sum up the direction the country has taken after it was first derailed in a very easy few sentences. Most of all, I have come this evening to give you a sense of what I believe is the only possible solution that could rescue the country. Before I get into it, let me just say that I'm going to be making a great many points this evening. you're going to have a lot to digest. So by way of tiny bit of self-promotion, just let me say that all of the points you will hear me make tonight are elaborated in much more careful detail, but simply expressed in that new book whose release date is August 19th. Tate Publishers released the book today. This is the official release date. So I'm really happy to have the opportunity to explain what the book is about to you. Okay, here goes. I've come to speak in tweets, and I'm going to do that a couple of times during this talk. Tweet 1, I have an idea. Let's let conservatism do to DC what liberalism did to Detroit. Depopulate the place. And I'm very serious, because here is my first major point that I'd like you to digest. The only way to save us is to wake our neighbors and send an army of Mr. Smiths to Washington to cut programs and close agencies. That I would like to see a priority of our congressmen and senators, and on the state level, state senators, assemblymen, local councilmen, to actually go to public office with a priority of cutting the size of government spending. Cutting the size of government and cutting the spending that fuels government. Now, this statement of mine, I'm going to repeat it a couple times. The only way to save us is to wake our neighbors and send an army of Mr. Smiths. And given the generations present, you all know that I'm talking about Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the wonderful Frank Capra, James Stewart movie. An army of Mr. Smiths to Washington to cut programs and close agencies. Now, this statement has two parts. What on earth do I mean by the only way to save us? You are all acquainted with a whole bunch of other solutions, quote unquote, to the problems of runaway government. Well, there's the fair tax, the flat tax, the idea of term limits, a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, Mark Levin's idea of a convention of the states, and the 11 some odd constitutional amendments he recommends that we adapt. And then there is Connie Mack, Florida representative, his penny plan. Take 1 penny off of every item on the budget, he says, and in 4 years the budget will be in balance. Well, those are well-intentioned solutions by a range of patriotic Americans who are appropriately concerned with the fate of this country. But every one of these measures deal in details, in issues that are essentially inessential. In other words, they address the symptoms of runaway government, not the cause of runaway government. For example, a fair tax, flat tax, tax reform. Taxes are only the result of runaway government spending that make everything difficult for us and destroys an economy. Budget deficits, the very same. Constitutional amendment to balance the budget in who knows how many years, if such an amendment could ever be agreed on and passed, deals with balancing the budget, but we are spending like mad, spending future generations into the poorhouse. That doesn't attack the root of the problem. The root of runaway taxes and runaway deficits and an accumulated debt that this summer surpassed $7.5 trillion on its way to $8 trillion. These are all symptoms of runaway government. Runaway government is the root of those problems, and I ask, what is the root of runaway government? That's what I think I can explain. Okay. So, if you are with me so far, if tax reform, a constitutional balanced budget amendment, term limit legislation. Okay, let's say we have term limits. Who is to say that the special interests aren't going to come up with a long string of political representatives who will do their bidding? That's no fundamental solution to term limits. What is the solution? To understand and deal with a fundamental problem, we must ask fundamental questions. If the subject is government, there are three fundamental questions that we can ask. What is government for? What must government do for us? And what must we be expected to do for ourselves? When can a free people, when must a free people say to their representatives, this far and no farther? Those are the questions I think I can answer. We can divide every service government performs, every item on the federal budget, into one of two categories. First, government can be a protector, protecting us in the enjoyment of what is ours, our lives, our liberties, our possessions, our families. Well, we know what is required for government to protect us, to keep us safe. We need the strongest military that could possibly be provided. We need federal prisons and local jails and judges. We need federal investigative agencies like the FBI. We need an intelligence agency that can gather information about the threats to this country from abroad, like the CIA. These are the things government provides, and we need them because if a people do not feel safe, they cannot feel free. 9/11 is a perfect illustration of that. And the fact is, Americans love their freedom, cherish their freedom, and will not easily surrender it. Notice the American flags, the proud display of patriotism that we saw in the days and weeks following 9/11. That is what is inside, what beats inside the breast of the average American, a love for this country and a love for freedom. But in the everyday struggle to get along, to save money, to go on vacation, to build one's business in this harsh climate, there's just no time for the deeper sense of freedom that we want, and so Americans are apathetic. The message they have to hear is that the majority can no longer afford to remain silent. That was the title of my first essay back in 1976. 34 years, 40 years, whatever it is, too early, but oh well. Okay, this is government acting as a protector, and I think I can safely say we all appreciate the need to be protected by these services government must provide. Anarchy doesn't work, as we've seen again this summer. We need the protection. Now, the first dollar government spends that goes not to protect all of us in the enjoyment of what is ours, lives, liberty, and possessions, but rather benefits some of us, ultimately at others' expense. That is a dollar that makes of government not a protector, but a provider. And what government is providing might as well be called welfare, regardless whether the recipient and beneficiary is rich or poor, young or old, healthy or sick. My tweet here is, defund Obamacare, then dismantle the rest of the welfare state. Make government a protector, not a provider. If you get a sense of what I'm suggesting by this dichotomy, government to protector and government to provider, you'll see how this can well be the solution to runaway government. Because fact is that as long as I have been myself following and teaching the federal budget, 80%, 80 cents on every dollar the federal government spends goes to some form of provider service. Add up the Pentagon, the CIA, the system of criminal justice with all the federal penitentiaries, the entire court system, Supreme Court down, and you total 20 cents on the sum of money that the federal government is spending. This is a massive way to shrink the size of government, reduce taxes, eliminate budget deficits, and gradually pay off the accumulated federal debt, national debt. If you get this much, if you see how broad a concept, a category, government the provider is, and how much it represents of the federal budget, then you actually can see when we first went off course. Anybody care to take a guess? While I take a break and get some water. Yes?
The war on poverty of President Johnson.
Johnson, 1964, 1965. Any other guesses?
Roosevelt.
Roosevelt, no. Social Security, now that certainly is part of the welfare entitlement state, yes. Income tax, Wilson's calamity, 1914, no. If you follow what I am describing as government acting as a provider and how broad this welfare category is, you will come to see that the origins of the American welfare state may be traced back to the second bill signed into law by our first president.
Oh, God.
That, if I'm not mistaken, was George Washington. It was the Tariff Act of 1789. It was, as soon as Congress was assembled in the spring of 1789, they received what were called memorials, remonstrances from all of the quote-unquote infant manufacturers who had such a difficult time dealing with foreign competition from England, from France, and so forth. And they pleaded with their congressmen, and they elected congressmen to pass a protective tariff, thereby raising the cost of goods coming from abroad, thereby allowing them, the domestic manufacturers, to raise their prices behind these tariff walls and get away with it. Why? Now, this is not a program that transfers income, but it benefited the manufacturers and at the expense of many other classes. Kindly tell them I'm not home right now. I'll get back to them. If you were a farmer in the West, a planter in the South, you could only get prices for your commodities, for your crops, that the market will sustain. If there was a bumper crop of cotton or wheat or whatever, the prices fell. You might not even make back the cost of the seed that you put in the ground. But you had to pay artificially higher prices for the tools, for nails, for kitchen items, for everything you bought that was manufactured because of that tariff. Same thing with planters, I said, farmers, I said. If you were a seaman, if you made your living in what was a brisk transatlantic trade, you were really hurt. The American ships were lying idle at their wharfs in Philadelphia, in New York, in Boston. Because if England couldn't sell their goods, or Europe couldn't sell their goods to us, they did not have the reserve currency to buy our goods that would be formerly shipped along all of the vessels from the sea coast ports. If you were a merchant who owned a fleet of ships or a few ships, again, they were lying at their wharfs, not used. No demand for American goods to Europe, because Europe couldn't sell their goods here. The Tariff Act of 1789 explicitly said that its purpose was, in part, not just to raise revenue, which the Constitution permits, but to encourage domestic manufacturers. You could look at the language after the meeting today. To encourage domestic manufacturers. That encouragement represented nothing but a benefit program for one class of Americans at the expense of others. 1789, spring. How did we get from that day to this? I'll say this twice. It's a lot to take in, but I've reduced it to as short an explanation as possible. Once a nation decides that some of its citizens have a right not to go out and get, but to sit still and be given, that nation finds itself torn by two questions. Who should be given, and just how much should they get? There's only one answer: politics. And as the demand for benefit programs rise, so does the supply of those programs, because, as de Tocqueville said in Democracy in America, the American empire will endure until Congress discovers that it can bribe the public with the public's money. And that is the nature of the process. It took decades, it took a couple of centuries to get where we are today. But if you think about it, every congressman, every senator certainly wants to service his constituents. He wants to give them the programs that will benefit them. But that congressman, that senator, in order to line up support for the programs his constituents want, let's call it Subsidy A, has to pledge his support for Subsidies B through Z, and we are taxed to the teeth to pay for the entire corrupt alphabet of welfare services and programs. Once you accept a principle, that principle must be accepted as an absolute. Make one fraction of that principle, defy it in one respect, and it's deuces wild. It's just a matter of time and circumstances until the principle itself is totally lost. Okay, that is my definition of welfare. Everything government is doing, which means Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Labor. These are all clientele agencies that exist to benefit their clients. Labor, Commerce, Agriculture, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Health and Human Services, of course, the Department of Education. In other words, if there can be mounted a righteous crusade of abolition against the principle of welfare as such, we literally can cut federal spending 75–80% without cutting any essential services at all. Because the only thing that is essential is the protection services we need and receive from government. Now, I want to go on to another point. You spoke today, and we all have a sense that the solution lies in returning to our founding principles, in returning to the Constitution, that however you see the direction as being the wrong direction, it's the founding principles, it's the Constitution itself that we have to retrieve. I agree with that. It's true. But I don't believe Americans, even Tea Party patriots, yet appreciate the full promise and implications of our founding principles. Because if there is to be a nationwide welfare revolt, it's not enough to say, well, government can be a protector and a provider, and let's get rid of government acting as a provider. On what basis do you eliminate the government as provider premise? How do you delegitimize all of the welfare programs and services and functions government performs? My answer is by understanding what the founding principles say about the limits of government's lawful authority. Jefferson wrote in the Declaration, and you heard a piece of this today, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here's what you already heard today. I want to repeat it and expand on it. To secure these rights, government is instituted among men, deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed. It's Jefferson in the Declaration. But he left something out. What powers do individuals have that they are therefore able to delegate to government? To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Well, the governed cannot consent to powers that the governed themselves do not possess. I'm going to argue now that just as not one of you has the right to give or take what belongs to another, so you have no possible power to delegate to government, enabling government to take from some to give to others. We don't have that right ourselves, but government derives its right from us. Well, if we never had the right to give away what isn't ours, how can government ever claim such a right? That's the shorthand version. I'd like to expand on that by reading between the lines of the Declaration of Independence, because that's where the true founder of America, John Locke, comes in. If you listen to Mark Levin, you hear him talking about John Locke or any of the great conservative broadcasters. Well, here's the point. John Locke identified 4 rights that every individual is born with. Yes, there is the right to life, which is the right to live our lives. But the right to live one's life is the right of liberty. The process of living is exercising our liberty and not being restricted. But Locke devotes a lot of time to this. So does James Madison in his writings. There's the right of life, there's the right of liberty. The third essential right is the right of property. It is the right to gain, keep, use, and dispose of the just fruits of our honest industry, the just fruits of honest labor. The right to gain, keep, use, and dispose of our property derives from the right of liberty itself. That property is ours. It belongs to no one else. It results from the labor a farmer puts into his land, improving the land, planting his crops. It involves the salary or the wages one gets from using one's labor, selling one's labor to one's employer. That is also part of the right of property. Now, life, liberty, property. I said there are 4 rights. Locke begins his thinking about rights in a state of nature. That's simply before there was government. He wants to find out, why do governments come about? And what is their purpose in being formed by those who form government, who enter what he called a social contract. The fourth right every individual possesses, naturally and at birth, is the right of self-defense. The right to hold on to what is his and to not see it stolen or seized by anyone else, because the property is his. But in a state of nature, life is very insecure and uncertain. There are thugs and looters and bad people in the world. As Rush Limbaugh always says, the world is governed by the aggressive use of force. Well, without government, we may have these rights, like liberty, property, and self-defense, but the protection, the preservation of these rights is not at all safe or secure. We therefore band together to form government, to erect political institutions, to put people in Congress and in the executive branch and judges in order to defend what is ours, our rights. But that's all we give to government. In other words, we delegate the right of self-defense. We agree not to be vigilantes, not to take the law into our own hands, but to rely on a rule of law and objective judges to discern the facts in any case where one is imputing an act of theft or a violation of rights. So that the only power government comes by, for Locke, for Jefferson, for all of the founders, well, not all, but the important ones, is the right to defend every individual. Individuals happily surrender their power to defend themselves to government in order to have all of their rights more carefully protected. No one would give up their life, their liberty, or their property to government. It is only to protect these better than they could be protected in the state of nature that individuals agree to form government and empower government. And so the only right individuals give up, and this is exactly what the Declaration of Independence intended, is the right of self-defense. But, unfortunately, at the beginning of this country, there wasn't a great many individuals who understood that, but rather, especially business interests, I call them counterfeit capitalists, who ran to government for all kinds of different species of provisions and welfare services and functions. It's a long story, and it is a sad and sorry story, because once you violate these principles, once you accept the idea that government has the right to benefit Paul by depriving Peter, or vice versa, then you are on the road to the welfare state, and it's just a matter of time and circumstance till it happens. So, bottom line for me, what this nation desperately needs, I call a great American welfare revolt. You all remember 1978, Jarvis-Gann tax revolt, which was a really pittance of a revolt just against property taxes in one state, in California. What is needed is for those who are supporting a fair tax, a flat tax, term limits, the penny plan, constitutional balanced budget amendments, to gather together and to wake our neighbors to the idea that all welfare provision are illegitimate on their face, and to send our representatives to government on all levels with clear instructions that their priority is to start dismantling the welfare state and making government a protector, depriving government of the power to pick winners and losers, because we all lose in the end. Okay, there are a couple of more important points that I want to make, but this is the outline of my suggestion to my country. If you have the temerity to advocate an end of welfare, well, we all know what you're going to be called. Cruel, heartless racists. There is no other explanation for anyone who would do this. And so, what you need, if you go along with me, is a moral backbone and the self-confidence to say to anyone who makes such an unjust accusation that welfare harms most the very people it is intended to help. And this in a whole host of ways. First of all, it strips individuals of their ambitiousness and of their self-esteem and their self-confidence. It makes them dependent. I have a tweet that says, there's a lot, liberal compassion consigns able-bodied men and women to an effort-free wonderland of stigmatized indigence. Of course, no one's ever grown rich on welfare. It traps them in that state of dependency, and that state of dependency is incompatible with human self-esteem or self-respect or success or striving. But worse than that, the welfare state, through its heavy-handed tax policies and regulatory policies and its deficits, draining billions of dollars out of a private economy, dollars that could have gone to as capital investment, it deprives those same welfare recipients of the opportunity. It takes away their moral independence and then deprives them of the opportunity of getting off welfare and becoming independent, because opportunity is foreclosed in a welfare state, as we are seeing since 2008. Second point I would make on this compassion question is not just that welfare harms most the very people it's intended to help, but that in a free society, there will always be sufficient benevolence, generosity, and goodwill, especially in a Christian nation such as ours, to provide for those few who truly cannot provide for themselves. And the entire history of this country, from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation forward and backwards, shows that there is sufficient compassion to help those. Anyone who says in a welfare-free society the poor will suffer without benefit of any assistance commits a unpardonable libel on the American people and on the entire history of this republic. That is covered in one of my chapters, If Not Welfare, Then What? And I go through the history of philanthropic charitable service that this country has engaged in from the start and up through its entire history. Just think of Jerry's Kids, all of the telethons we watched every Labor Day. For how many decades? Okay, so yes, it takes moral courage to stand up against the welfare state, but the arguments are on our side. Finally, if you have taken in the significance of what I am proposing, you will realize that what I am proposing will take a terrible cost on this country. The dislocations, the public servants who will lose their jobs as agencies are closed, the people who will not have benefit of farm subsidies, ethanol subsidies, so welfare, that's the same business, corporate bailouts, on and on and on. That will create dislocations. It will not be a happy time. I liken it to any kind of drug dependency. Anyone who's been dependent on a drug, fill in the blank, alcohol, heroin, whatever, needs to go through a period where life is going to be extremely harsh, where the physical complications resulting from becoming sober are going to be painful. But on the other side of that pain is a great possibility of resurrection, of renewal, of building one's life. And once this nation, should it start down the road of a welfare revolt, which means in time taxes can be dramatically reduced, deficits eliminated, the public debt paid off, capital freed for what capital supposed to be doing, generating new jobs, new technologies, and we are on the verge of enormous new technologies to make life so much easier. If this nation puts the world on notice that the days of the welfare state are numbered, it will attract capital from around the world, because capital will be rewarded through greater profits. And whatever the dislocation in the meantime, the result will be liberating for 315 million Americans, all of whom will ultimately benefit by returning to the founding principles and making government a protector, not a provider. I'll just finish with one of my tweets also. A nation is as great as it is free. Prosperity, the fruit of freedom, is simply the material expression of its greatness and its greatest practical reward. Let us once again be a free nation. That's it. Thank you. My policy, I don't know what time the library closes, but my policy is to give you all a little break, take some water, and stick around until the very last question of me is asked and answered. Al?
So take a deep breath. Nobody moves for the break, right? Everybody knows once you move, you're like, oh, let's go. So, look, just a couple of things. One, there's a sheet in the back of the room that really addresses, I think it's the, Kath, what's the title of that one green sheet that's action, responsibility?
Accountability projects and responsibility.
Oh yeah, accountability projects. That is really for people who want to engage, as we talked about, want to engage on some of the principles that we've heard here tonight. Some people at the last meeting did sign up for that, and I've been emailing them and contacting them. But we need to have a core activist group, people that will step up and do things, and can be trained simply. You know, people heard me say this before. Some people can do this much. Some people can do this much. Some people can do this much. There's a lot of different things people can do of different size and quantity. But we're a lot better off if we have a lot of people doing this much than we have 2 people doing this much. That's why, if you're interested in finding out more about what you can do, what's available to do, and staying informed, and there is that sheet back at the end before you leave tonight. Be glad to do that. That would be really helpful. And so I guess that's really good. So let me just hand you the...
Okay, I just want to read something that I put in this book. It's one of my favorite passages by an American scholar who no one ever heard of. His name is Irving Brandt. Did a book called The Bill of Rights. At the end of the book, he closes like this. In all the world's history, there is nothing to compare with the pledges of human rights and freedom that have been worked into our charter of government at the great moments of national history, 1776, 1787. It is only at great moments that such advances are possible. Between such moments, there is most likely to be first a contented coasting on a path made smooth by established rights, then forgetfulness of those rights, finally a challenge of them fired by passion made dangerous by ignorance, that leads either to the loss of liberty or to the restoration of freedom through the re-emerging spirit of the people. That is the challenge Americans face today. And it's not about 1,000 different items on a state budget or a federal budget to debate. It's about freedom. And freedom is incompatible with any form of welfare. If you have the freedom to live your life, to keep and enjoy the fruit of your labor, then no one has a right to take that from you unless you freely give it. And all government is doing today is taking and taking and taking what is ours. And all that is necessary for freedom to be resurrected and preserved is to understand that how dare anyone presume to give away the fruit that you labored for. Once that is understood and spread, everything else falls like dominoes, the entire welfare state. And once again, I'm here for questions, but I leave you with the idea that if we can persuade our neighbors of these few founding principles, there is a country to save, and there are future generations who will thank you for your efforts. Okay. Any questions? I'm all yours.
Yes. What do we do about all the people, especially the young, who have been brainwashed into a completely different idea about the purpose of government and what is nice? I agree with you, of course, but we've got all these people driving around with Obama stickers. They're all teaching our kids. That's why they have Obama stickers. And it's almost like what's happening in the Middle East, you know, where the Arabs are poisoning their children, teaching them about what the Israelis do. We are poisoning our children here in this country with our schools, with our government schools.
I'm curious. Are you expecting an answer?
What can you do about it? You know, how are you going to get your army to march on Washington when the country is populated by idiots?
He's right. That's a big part of the problem. Look at the age cohorts you represent. Are your children, are their children going to be sitting at Tea Party meetings on a Tuesday night? So it is literally up to us of our generation to pass our heritage down. And if we don't, the colleges will not fill the breach. And I say that as someone who teaches at a college, a university, and a private Roman Catholic university. Now, and your basic point is well worth emphasizing. Ladies and gentlemen, there is so much we can do by way of waking our neighbors, but it's the colleges that hold the key. It's the colleges that teach the next generation of journalists and judges, opinion leaders in every field, the people who are going to write the screenplays and the poetry and the novels. And if they're learning socialism from their professors, and that's about all they're learning, then the colleges are lost, and if the colleges are lost, the country is lost. I don't know a short answer. Will be now that the book is now released, I will be speaking to college audiences. There are, I guess this is what I can say by way of offering any encouragement, there are very large, well-organized, educated groups on our campuses. Young Americans for Freedom, Students for Liberty. I'm the faculty advisor for the local Student of Liberty chapter at Seton Hall. And even young conservatives and Republicans, the 10,000s who go to CPAC every year supporting Ron Paul or Rand Paul, all college-age students. They will be tomorrow's college professors, just like today's college professors are the student radicals of the 60s, of the anti-war movement. They are the chairs of their departments in all the humanities and social sciences. They are the corruptors of the minds of your children and grandchildren. But they are like a spent force. We see the results of socialism. All of Europe is turning against it. China moved kind of in a direction of some corrupted capitalism. They see the inefficiency of 5-year plans. So I think that the radicalism, the left-wing radicalism that you speak of, is a spent force. Kids on college campuses, they mouth the slogans due to the peer pressure that's put on them by their professors and other students. But they don't understand what they're saying. They don't believe it. They can be reached. And the answer is the few college professors who are conservatives, libertarians, students of Ayn Rand, objectivists, they are making their way into the upper echelons of academia. No one's tried to fire me, and I have not been hung in effigy in all my years at Seton Hall. That's encouraging right there. As a matter of fact, the dean is waiting for the first student complaint about me. I'm very engaging and approachable and warm and everything. Even if you disagree. Oh, and I tell my students the first day of class, no one in the world has to agree with me about anything. And no one will be penalized for any point of view you express in class discussion, in your final exams, on your term papers. Feel free. I believe in the first principle the nation was founded on, one of Locke's greatest principles, toleration. Tolerance of dissenting opinion. And that is my prime directive, never to violate that. And it gets me scores points with my students. So maybe in time, in 5 years or 10 years, we will see the work of all of these student activists as conservatives, as libertarians, become the next generation of college professors who will put out better people into the world as opinion leaders. Whew. That's my answer. Yes?
Actually,
Oh, no, a woman behind you and maybe, please.
In regards to the Charter of 1789, the founding fathers had based their principles on John Locke. Haven't they read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations?
Actually, they not only read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, but they read Jefferson's most prized economist, a man lost to history known as Destutt de Tracy, who was France's answer to Adam Smith and wrote earlier than Adam Smith, actually. But there were corrupt, what I call counterfeit capitalists, who wanted protection from the risks of a free market, and they wanted favors and privileges, and they bought congressmen and senators and sent them to Congress, and they had a very wise defender named Alexander Hamilton, who was Washington's Treasury Secretary, and he argued that the nation desperately needs to build up its manufacturers. What if we get into another war? And England was always threatening in those years that we need to produce our own cannon, our own rifles and muskets, and we need to support our manufacturers. Jefferson was dead against it. There's a wonderful book Jefferson wrote called The Anas, A-N-A-S, where he documents all of his arguments with Hamilton over the size of lawful government and the distinction between lawful and lawless government. Unfortunately, Washington sided with Hamilton, not Jefferson, in that debate, and we had the tariff protection, and we had expensive land costs that led to speculation that created the first and second financial panics the country suffered. That's a story that's told in this book, actually. Here's another, for the price of admission, here's another interesting historical point. There is no such thing as a cycle of boom or bust. There is no business cycle in capitalism. I have personally studied every single financial panic and period of depression, and in every single case, I can point to the precise government corporate welfare policies that led to an artificial boom during an inflationary period that eventually bust and led to a financial panic, Wall Street crashing, depression. The first one comes in 1792, the second in 1807, the third in 1819. And every 20 years, and they were all the result of government policies that government had no business engaging in to begin with. And this latest crash of ours in 2008, the housing boom, was just another example of corrupt politics fueled by greedy speculators, housing speculators in this case, that led to calamity. But there is nothing in a free market system that creates such circumstances. It is always the corruption of government in order to prop up the economy and enrich politically connected interests that goes bust and sends the nation into a tailspin. Yes, I did say.
Apropos of what you just said, I'm going to say something else later, but apropos of what you just said, Barack Obama has printed paper money, $85 billion for the last 2 years. He's increased our debt in 3 years to $3 trillion. Since he came on board, he has put $7 trillion. All the presidents in the history of the United States combined have not added our debt to $3 trillion or $7 trillion. But that's only the blind part. If you look at the entire debt indebtedness of the United States, it's something like $123 trillion when you look at the commitments for Social Security.
Unfunded liabilities.
Unfunded liabilities.
Actually, it's $7 gazillion. It's just how far you want to go out into the future. Promissory notes that the country has no possibility of ever honoring.
Well, we can't honor it.
Right.
But what's happening right now before our very eyes, China has, and you hear it every day on the radio, the Chinese are buying up all the gold. Right now, China bought a building on Wall Street, and the building used to belong to Rockefeller. And why did they want that building? Because it had the largest gold vault outside of the box. And the Chinese, 5 stories below the ground, and the Chinese now are in possession of 7,000, in excess of 7,000 tons of gold. They are the leaders in gold. We don't even have one copper penny behind every dollar that we print. Now, what is Obama doing? He's playing the biggest Ponzi game that's ever been perpetrated on the United States. He is flooding $85 billion a month he's giving it to the banks with the proviso that the banks make sure it gets into the stock market. Now, you look at the stock market and everybody judges by the stock market and they say, the stock market is rising, but it's rising with paper money.
Let me stop you here. There is nothing you said that I can disagree with. It's true. It's taking us a little far afield from the issue. In other words, we can't control what the Chinese are doing. We can control what the federal government is doing, and we had better get the federal government under control before the whole house caves in. We don't know what the trigger is going to be. We don't know if it's going to be Sacramento going bankrupt after Detroit, or how many other cities, states can't go bankrupt under the Constitution, but how many, and New Jersey is in terrible shape, but so is New York, so are all of the states. A threatened default of all of the bonds by any major city or state could collapse the entire market in a day, in an hour, and we don't know what that trigger point is going to come. If you remember 3 weeks ago, Argentina had a case whereby it didn't want to pay its interest on its accumulated debt off, and the courts decided that they had to, but the stock market lost almost 300 points in one day, the Dow did, over that incident. So the point I'm making here is that all of this gentleman's danger points are real danger points, and there is no time to dawdle. There is a welfare revolt that needs to get off the ground this year.
No, go ahead, finish your point.
That needs to get off the ground this year, and there are painfully few Americans who would even listen to such a proposal as you all nice folk have today. I say that there must be a concerted effort to enlist those individuals who are amenable to such an idea. And that is the only hope the country has, not waiting 8 years for a constitutional convention or a flat tax or the rest of it.
Can I?
Only if you stick to the point.
Well, I deviated because you can't discuss this magnitude argument, or an argument of such magnitude, and stay right on the point. You have to go
No.
Okay. But anyway, let me explain.
Did I ever tell you about my fishing trip in July? No.
Okay. What I'm saying to you, that earlier this year, 6 nations, starting with China, Soviet Union, South Africa, Germany, Great Britain, they had a special meeting. There's another nation I don't remember right now. And
Again, you're taking time with other problems, and I grant that they are problems, but I would like to stick to anyone who has questions about the theme that I developed in this talk. Yes.
My question is, when do you think, I think it's going to happen before the bond market gives all these, the United States or all these states a major downgrading. When do you think that, let's say, China's going to say, you know what, we're just cutting you off, we're not buying your bonds anymore?
That's the end of the ball game. We are so dependent on China buying our treasury bills, but on the other hand, they already are holding so much of our treasury bills that they lose big time if they cut us off. It's the end of us, but it's the end of them also. So I don't know. That could very well be a trigger, or just the fear of that, or some big Chinese government official making noises about such an occurrence happening could send us into a total tailspin.
Do you see that coming up fairly shortly?
Nobody talks to me at all about the future. Go ahead. Yes.
Do you think there's anything the federal government does aside from law enforcement and national defense that's not welfare? Anything?
That's a great question. I try to think of things. I guess you'd have to say environmental regulations. And I disagree with the environmental regulations entirely as well. The EPA is the most disastrous and dangerous agency of all the agencies of the federal government. What they are doing to the coal industry in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia is an absolute disgrace, just as what they did to the lumber industry in Oregon and Washington two decades ago is a disgrace. But do we need to be protected from environmental dangers? Yes, we do. But do we need an EPA to protect us? No. As far as I'm concerned, it's like this. If a CEO of a corporation, like the trouble General Motors has been having with their accelerator pedals, starting a fire or whatever, if a CEO has knowledge of a dangerous product he is marketing, and he sits on that knowledge. That is not a matter for the EPA or Consumer Protection. That's a matter for the Attorney General. And once we start putting CEOs who recklessly endanger the public safety through their corporations, once they are given lifetime sentences in prison, hard time labor, then the environmental damage where groundwater is polluted or the air is polluted and there are clusters of cancer that can be directly related to chemicals Monsanto or whatever is spewing out. Once these CEOs and who are found guilty of having knowledge and covering up the knowledge, recklessly endangering the safety of the public, once they start serving 40, 50 lifetime sentences in prison, we won't have an environmental problem anymore. So that's just one way I would handle what would be considered not welfare.
Just one thing.
Yes.
The interstate highway system, is that welfare?
Yes. And it would not have been necessary. Highways are very profitable endeavors. There were turnpike roads going back to colonial times where investors got together, they bought land between two waterways, say, that were navigable, and they built a road, and cities are going to spring up where their road was. There would be able to be turnpikes, there would be able to be fueling stations of whatever variety, or restaurants. So it would not, the country would have looked very different. But it could have been done for the same motive everything is done, a profit motive. When it's time, what happens is because there was national turnpikes and national roads and a transcontinental railroad, these were all welfare giveaways to corporate interests. And in every case, they led to panic and depression. In 1837, in 1857, in 1872, in 1892, the country fell into depression because, for example, the Transcontinental Railroad, you'll remember in the 8th grade, you read about the Golden Spike at Promontory Point, Utah. This was, as Andrew Carnegie called it, building railroads from nowhere to nowhere at public expense. The principals, namely one J. Cook, in his banks in Philadelphia and Chicago, who did a lot of underwriting for the railroads and got huge subsidies and grants of land along the right-of-way, made fortunes. They built a whole economy out of an industry that was doomed to bankruptcy because there was nobody to ship their goods back east, and there was nobody to go west to the Indian territories where the railroad was constructed. It was too early. The first transcontinental railroad that succeeded was James J. Hill's Great Northern, and he didn't accept and he didn't ask for a nickel of public expense. He underwrote it himself, and he made his railroad profitable because it was on sound principles, not mainly for land and speculation and subsidies offered by government. So that's my answer there. Yes?
Can the Federal Reserve be eliminated or reformed?
Eliminated. There is no need for a Federal Reserve. There's no need for a national bank. Anyone interested in this topic, I knew a fellow in, at the time, NYU, George Selgin, who I think is today the leading economist, talking about private banking system and that there's no need for a Federal Reserve. And in fact, the Federal Reserve has engineered the monetary inflations that led to the bubbles that sooner or later had to burst, that sent the country into depression and crisis. And the country did not let any crisis go to waste. It always fueled bigger government. We didn't need Rahm Emanuel to teach us that lesson. Yes?
Yes. This summer's Heritage newsletter discusses the welfare and supports your opinion.
Heritage.
Yes.
That is news to me. That is good news to me. I can stand a little competition. I'm going to look into that, certainly. Thank you very much for passing that along. Do they define welfare as I do? Well, yeah, what I'm doing is not stark raving mad, in the sense that we all have a concept of social welfare and corporate welfare, and especially libertarian organizations and map publications and all have been talking about the evil of corporate welfare as well. I just boiled it all down to government to protect the government to provider, and anytime government provides anything to anyone, it is providing welfare, and there is no legitimate basis for such a provision, and we must dismantle and eliminate every vestige of it, and then we have a free country. But I'm going to look into Heritage. Heritage is one of the greatest organizations around today. Yes?
What do you think the framers would say about what you just said? So take, for example, the patent office. Giving patents to somebody is to protect one person. So I just wonder what you...
Intellectual property, the word property is in it, so it must be a good thing. Intellectual property, the fruit of one's intellectual labor, whether a scientist or a playwright, they are entitled to the benefit of what they produced. And we all benefit from the protection granted to intellectual property. If Bill Gates didn't have protection for his operating system and everything else, we wouldn't have had his operating system. So intellectual property is a legitimate concept that a free government will protect. The details of it are way beyond the scope of my creativity.
There's nothing that the framers did.
Well, of course, Jefferson believed very strongly, and the Constitution contains language protecting intellectual property and creating the patent office.
But I just, I saw that as, that's the first example that came to my mind.
Nice try.
Individual.
Nice try. Yeah, no, that's exactly, yeah, challenge me. Make it worth coming here from Brooklyn, New York. Really, I appreciate that. I'm going to be challenged at some point. Might as well start here. But a good thought, but I believe intellectual property is a form of property. By the way, there are libertarians who disagree with me. There are libertarians who don't want a patent office or copyright protection, that for the same reason. Now, why should one person benefit from something? And we have this problem with the medical industry, with the pharmaceutical industry. Any company could make any medication that is awarded patent protection, which justifies the $25 million needed to meet the FDA's hurdles in order to get a license to produce it. And if anybody else could produce it, well, we wouldn't have these medications. I'm sorry, they would not exist if it wasn't for the potential profits that come from the 1 in 20. I'm just making that up. I don't know what the exact ratio is. The 1 in 20 medications that finally get to the product and are fighting cancer and diabetes and high blood pressure and all the rest of it. Yes?
There are a lot of tough people, a lot of tough corporations. They're not going to go away just because we told them. There's nothing to do about them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the only antidote to corrupt corporations and corrupt politicians is the voice of the people, throwing out of office all of those who coddle the corrupt counterfeit capitalist interests. Short of that, the corruption continues. American politics is nothing but a tissue of corruption. That is all it comes down to. And another one of my tweets is kick the establishment politicians of both parties out of power and build a tidal wave of Tea Party patriotism.
Yeah.
And that's the answer. If that can be built, the nation has a chance. Okay, any other comments, criticisms, snide cracks, anything you care to say at all? Yes. Uh-oh. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, you again.
Okay, actually, I started to tell you about what the Chinese are doing with the gold. Now, the reason...
Do you mind if I have dinner first? I'm joking, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, what they intend to do, right now, we can print the dollar because the world thinks that our dollar is infallible, okay? But the Chinese know that it's paper. And what they want to do, they want the Chinese yuan to be the international currency of the world. Once that happens, we will have a depression here that every dollar that's in the bank will be worthless. And that's the beginning, and that'll be the beginning of this thing that you say, where people who've been apathetic and dormant all their lives, when they start losing the shekels they got in their pocket, they will all become Tea Party members, or even more radical than Tea Party.
I agree with the basic point. Another one of my tweets, when will the low information voter wake up?
Yes.
When life becomes so tough that he can no longer afford to sit still. And that's what it's going to take. I recommend an essay I wrote for the American Thinker called Let's Hear It for the Low Information Voter. And I developed that theme, that America is with us. They just don't know it. They make a very simple error. They take their freedoms for granted because they are simply unaware of the threat to their freedoms that mount every day in this country. Is that okay? Once their backs are against the wall, once they feel the threat, the impending danger to their free way of life, I think they will wake up, and that's what 9/11 represented. That 9/11 was a brief wake-up call, but it said you cannot take your safety or your freedom or your families for granted. You are under direct threat, and that's when every porch and every car antenna flew the American flag. Americans love their country, they love their freedom, they are simply unaware of how their freedoms are slipping away right through their fingers. Once they become aware, through whatever cataclysmic tripwire that is sprung, we will have an audience to reach. The trick is, before that day, reaching your neighbors and giving them whatever information is possible to let them know what kind of horror lies ahead and enlisting them in our Tea Party cause.
What if you don't speak Spanish?
There's nothing we can do then. It's hopeless.
Yes, thank you. For those of you who have not yet purchased the Doctor's Good book, Everything You Have, there are some copies back there yet that you can still get.